On October 14, 1944, two generals from the German army stepped out of a car in front of a house in southwestern Germany. Inside the house was Erwin Rommel, the most famous field marshal of the Third Reich. The generals presented him with two options. The first was a trial for treason against Hitler that would drag his family into concentration camps. The second was a cyanide capsule and a state funeral. Manfred Rommel, his son, was 16 years old and was present when they took him away. 6 months later, he deserted the German army and surrendered to the French general who had pursued his father across North Africa. During the interrogation, he revealed how the marshal had truly died. Meanwhile, his wife kept for decades the letters in which Rommel referred to Hitler as the master. In addition, he had another woman as well, Walburga Stemmer, a fruit vendor from Weingarten, to whom he wrote letters promising a perfect house where they would live together, and with whom he had a daughter whose existence was hidden throughout his life. This is the story of what happened inside the Rommel family during the 80 years that followed that October morning. Why did the regime that turned him into the most famous general of the war demand his death in secret? How did a woman live for half a century inside a family without her true surname being acknowledged? And what exactly did those letters say that his wife kept hidden for decades? The sacrifice of the desert fox. How were the final hours of Erwin Rommel, and what revenge followed his death? On October 14, 1944, Erwin Rommel had been recovering for 3 months at his home in Herrlingen, a town in southwestern Germany, when two army generals stepped out of a car in front of his door. They were not traveling alone. Behind them in the vehicle, two military doctors waited who had not been introduced to anyone. Germany's most famous field marshal, the man whose name had appeared in headlines across 3 continents during 4 years of war, already knew why they had come. His personal aide, Captain Hermann Aldinger, understood it as well the moment he saw the vehicles. No one in that house believed that the visit had anything to do with his recovery. It had been exactly 13 years since Rommel had entered the inner circle of Nazi power. From the earliest stages of the war, he had received from Hitler a level of distinction that no other general in the Wehrmacht enjoyed so consistently. Extraordinary promotions far outside the usual scale, personal deliveries of decorations, direct telephone calls to the front that bypassed the normal chain of command, and a propaganda campaign that turned his face into the face of German invincibility in North Africa. The regime had manufactured him as a symbol just as much as it had used him as a soldier, and now it needed to dispose of him. Rommel's connection to the July 20th, 1944 conspiracy was real, although its exact nature remains a subject of historical debate. The conspirators who planned to kill Hitler and negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies had counted on him as a figure of authority for the transition period after the assassination, not as a direct executor of the plan, but as the name capable of legitimizing a provisional government before enemy powers. Rommel knew of the conspiracy's existence. He had heard the plans in sufficient detail for his name to circulate during the interrogations that followed the failed July 20th attack. When the Gestapo extracted confessions under torture that dragged hundreds of people toward the guillotine of the Volksgerichtshof, several conspirators mentioned him. Whether those statements reflected real involvement or were the product of desperate men trying to distribute blame before dying was never established with certainty. What was established, however, with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized the repressive apparatus of the Third Reich was that suspicion was enough. In the police state Germany had built over 11 years, the distinction between a verified culprit and an identified suspect had lost all procedural relevance. Rommel had become politically inconvenient, which was the only category that mattered. The two generals who entered the house that morning were Wilhelm Burgdorf, chief of the Army Personnel Office, and Ernst Meisel, a subordinate of Burgdorf in the same office. Both had received direct instructions from Hitler. The conversation they held with Rommel in private for nearly an hour left the field marshal with two options. The first option was a trial before the Volksgerichtshof, presided over by Judge Roland Freisler, whose court had already prosecuted the principal conspirators of July 20th. Such a trial ended in only one direction, but it did not end solely with the death of the accused. The families of those convicted of high treason automatically lost all legal protection. Lucy Rommel, the marshal's wife, and Manfred, his 15-year-old son, would be exposed to Sippenhaft. the Nazi principle of collective family responsibility that had already sent the relatives of dozens of July 20th conspirators to prisons and concentration camps in the preceding weeks. The pension granted to the widow of a field marshal would be cancelled. The name Rommel would become synonymous with treason in the official records of the Reich. The second option was a cyanide capsule. If Rommel took it within the next few hours, the official Wehrmacht report would announce that the field marshal had succumbed to wounds suffered during an Allied air attack on July 17th when his vehicle was strafed on a road in Normandy, and he was severely injured in the skull. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. The Führer would express his personal condolences. Lucy would keep the pension. Manfred would not be disturbed. The family would remain under the implicit protection of a name that the regime had decided to keep spotless for propaganda reasons. Rommel left the meeting and went upstairs to his room. He spoke with Lucy. He told her what had happened and what he had decided. Then he called Manfred, who was home on leave from the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Anti-Aircraft Battery, where he had been serving as an assistant since the age of 14, and explained with a precision no father should ever have to exercise that in 15 minutes he would be dead. Not because he had been defeated on the battlefield, not because his wounds were insurmountable, but because the state he had served for 13 years had decided he was more useful as a martyr than as a living general. He told him not to cry and to take care of his mother. At 12:30 in the afternoon, Erwin Rommel left his house in Herrlingen, dressed in uniform, holding his field marshal's baton in his hand. He turned toward the doorway where Lucy and Manfred were watching him. As he walked toward the car, Bergdorf and Meisel accompanied him. The vehicle drove along the local road for several hundred meters, stopped at a secluded spot, and Rommel swallowed the capsule. It took him between 10 and 15 minutes to die. He was 52 years old. Less than an hour later, the telephone in the Herrlingen house rang with the news that the field marshal had suffered a sudden collapse during the journey. That same afternoon, the official Wehrmacht communiqué reported that Erwin Rommel had died as a result of wounds received in combat. The news was received in Germany with the national mourning the regime had carefully planned. Newspapers, radio stations, and the propaganda machinery of Joseph Goebbels constructed within hours the narrative of a heroic and dignified death, that of a soldier who had given his life to his country to the very end. Hitler ordered Rommel's coffin to be displayed in Ulm for several hours so that the public could pay their respects. The Reich organized a state funeral of such magnitude that foreign correspondents accredited in Berlin described it as the most elaborate funeral ceremony the regime had staged for any military figure since the beginning of the war. The family that had just lost their father and husband under those circumstances had to appear at the funeral and behave as if everything being said about that man were true. Lucy and Manfred knew it was not, and they also knew that their survival depended on no one else discovering the truth. The lie that had killed Erwin Rommel was at the same time the only shield protecting the two people for whom he had sacrificed everything. What the regime had not calculated was that the same conscience that had led Rommel to choose death in order to protect his son was the conscience that that son had begun to develop silently since that October morning. The capture of Rommel's son and the marshal's secret woman. When the German army conscripted Manfred Rommel into the Reichsarbeitsdienst in early 1945, the Western Front had been collapsing for months at a pace that even the Wehrmacht's own commanders had stopped trying to conceal in their internal reports. In that context, the Reich's compulsory labor service continued to recruit German teenagers for logistical support tasks and the construction of defensive positions, effectively a reservoir of bodies that the regime sent to slow what had already become inevitable. Manfred was 16 years old when he deserted his unit near Riedlingen, a town on the banks of the Danube in southwestern Württemberg, during the first days of April 1945. His desertion was the result of the practical dissolution of the military structure in that area, where units were losing cohesion as older soldiers disappeared, surrendered individually, or simply stopped reporting to formations. French troops of the Liberation Army, belonging to the First French Army under the command of General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, were advancing from the south and southwest at a speed that made any coherent defensive reorganization impossible. Manfred was captured by advanced French units shortly after abandoning his position without resistance and without incident. What happened during his interrogation as a prisoner of war permanently altered the official narrative that the Nazi regime had constructed around the death of his father. Jean de Lattre de Tassigny was, in April 1945, one of the most significant Allied military commanders in the Western European theatre. He had escaped from Vichy France in 1942, crossed to London to join de Gaulle's Free France, and later directed the operations of the First French Army during the Provence landings in August 1944 and the subsequent campaign through the Vosges and toward the Rhine. The fact that the son of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had fallen prisoner to his forces in the final days of the war in Europe was, from de Lattre's perspective, a matter that warranted personal attention. During the interrogation, Manfred Rommel revealed to the French general the exact sequence of events of October 14, 1944. The arrival of Generals Burgdorf and Meisel in Herrlingen, the contents of the ultimatum presented to his father, the choice of the cyanide capsule as an alternative to a trial before the Volksgerichtshof, and the official Wehrmacht communiqué that had attributed the death to the war wounds suffered in Normandy. It was the first time this information had left the private sphere of the family. The Nazi regime had maintained the secret with an efficiency that depended on only Lucy and Manfred knowing the truth, and on both of them having direct and concrete reasons not to reveal it while the Reich still stood. With Germany's surrender only weeks away, those reasons had ceased to exist. Allied intelligence services had accumulated during the years of the war a considerable amount of indirect information about the real circumstances of Rommel's death. Several testimonies from German officers captured earlier had suggested that the official statement did not correspond to reality. But without a direct witness, it had been impossible to establish the sequence with precision. Manfred's testimony closed that gap. Manfred's statement was documented by French intelligence services and later shared with Allied teams preparing materials for the Nuremberg trials, which would begin in November 1945. In that process, the testimony regarding Rommel's death gained a significance that went beyond the story of a single family. It became part of the broader case against the leadership of the Nazi state, specifically in relation to crimes committed against members of the German army itself who had been accused of conspiracy. Wilhelm Burgdorf, one of the two generals who had delivered the ultimatum in Herrlingen, died by his own hand in the Berlin bunker on May 2, 1945, alongside Martin Bormann. Ernst Meisel was captured by the Allies, tried in the proceedings known as the German High Command case, and convicted in 1948, although his sentence was later reduced and he served less than 3 years in prison. The impact of Manfred's testimony on Rommel's public image was complex and did not unfold immediately. In the months following Germany's surrender, the Allies had strategic reasons to carefully manage how Rommel's figure would be incorporated into the narrative of the war. The British Army, in particular, had already built during the war itself an image of Rommel as a respectable adversary, partly as an instrument of its own propaganda and partly as a genuine reflection of the admiration his tactical leadership inspired. Montgomery had referred to him in favourable terms in internal communications. Churchill had called him a great general in a speech before the House of Commons in 1942, something that had drawn criticism within his own party. That pre-existing image made it easier to absorb Manfred's testimony into an interpretive framework that benefited several sides: the Allies, who could demonstrate that even Germany's best generals had been victims of the regime; the new West Germany, which needed military figures who could be reintegrated into the national imagination without bearing the full weight of war crimes; and the Rommel family, who went from being the family of a possible conspirator to the family of a martyr who had died after being denounced. Manfred was released without charges in 1945. The Germany to which he returned no longer existed in any recognizable institutional sense. The 4 occupation zones divided the country among the victorious powers. The major cities had suffered massive destruction from aerial bombing. The administrative, judicial, and educational systems that had functioned under the Reich were being dismantled and rebuilt simultaneously under Allied supervision. Millions of displaced Germans, former prisoners of war, camp survivors, and refugees from the Eastern Territories were moving across a country that still had no government of its own and no defined political identity. In that context, Lucy Rommel maintained in Herrlingen the same discretion she had practiced during the final months of the war. American and British intelligence officers questioned her in the period immediately following the surrender. The conversations were procedural and did not lead to any formal proceedings. There was no legal basis for action against her. She had been the wife of an officer whom the regime itself had killed, and the pension she retained had been the price the Nazi state had paid for his death. In 1912, Erwin Rommel was 19 years old. He had just returned to his regiment in Weingarten after completing his training at the Kriegsschule in Danzig and was maintaining almost daily correspondence with Lucy Mollin, the daughter of a Prussian landowner to whom he had become informally engaged during his studies. At the market in Weingarten, he met Walburga Stemmer, the daughter of a seamstress who was 20 years old and worked at a fruit stand. In December 1913, a year after that encounter, Walburga gave birth to a girl whom they named Gertrude, registered under her mother's surname because the laws of the German Empire allowed no other possibility for children born to unmarried parents. Rommel's mother, Helena von Loos, the daughter of the civil governor of Ulm, opposed with an uncompromising firmness any formalization of that relationship. Walburga Stemmer was not the kind of woman suitable for the social position of an officer in the Imperial Army. Rommel broke with her. He married Lucy on November 27, 1916, during a leave from the war. But he did not break contact with Walburga or with the child. During the following years, Rommel provided financial support to Walburga and Gertrude and maintained correspondence with them from his various postings. The correspondence with Walburga, most of which has been preserved, was that of a man who had not entirely closed that chapter of his life. In the letters he called her his little mouse, Mäuschen, wrote about plans to build her a perfect house where they would live together, and promised her a future that his real circumstances made impossible to fulfill. The same man who during World War II would be presented to the Western public as an iron-willed commander, methodical and emotionally inaccessible, had written to a fruit vendor from Weingarten in the language of a young man promising what he could not sustain. When the war broke out in August 1914, Rommel modified his life insurance policy to include Gertrude as a beneficiary in case he died in combat. When the war ended and he remained alive, he continued maintaining contact. He took Gertrude on some trips. He photographed her with the family. Lucy knew that Gertrude was Erwin's daughter. She accepted her presence as a non-negotiable condition of their marriage, although she established one requirement that would remain in place for decades. Manfred had to believe that she was his cousin, not his sister. Walburga never abandoned the expectation that Rommel would return. As long as Erwin and Lucy remained without children, that hope had some sentimental basis, however fragile. In 1928, Lucy became pregnant with Manfred, according to the account that Gertrude would pass on decades later to her son Josef Pan. Walburga took an overdose of medication when she learned of the pregnancy. Her death was officially recorded as pneumonia. Years later, the family doctor confirmed to Gertrude that it had been a death by her own will. Gertrude was 15 years old. Her mother had died because the man who had not married her had finally had a child with another woman. Rommel and Lucy took responsibility for the girl. From then on, Gertrude lived in the immediate environment of the Rommel family under the designation Cousin Gertrude, Cousine Gertrude, a fiction that Lucy had imposed as a condition and that Gertrude accepted and maintained throughout her life. She was a frequent visitor, present at moments that did not correspond to the role of a cousin. She was at Erwin's bedside when he was recovering from his injuries at the field hospital in Sfax in 1943 after a health collapse that doctors attributed to accumulated exhaustion. She was in the house in Herrlingen during the convalescence of 1944. It was she who, on at least one occasion, answered the telephone in the house during those months, taking a call from a furious Hitler who demanded that his marshal return to the Normandy front before his wounds had fully healed. During the 4 years of campaigning in North Africa, in the dozens of photographs of Rommel that circulated in the international press, the marshal invariably wore a checkered scarf wrapped around his neck beneath the Afrika Korps uniform, both in posed portraits and in command images. That scarf had been knitted by Gertrude and sent to him as a gift. Her father wore it whenever he had the opportunity. Gertrude married in 1946 to Josef Pan, a fruit vendor in Württemberg as her mother had been, and had 3 children, Josef, Helga and Anton. She died in 2000 in Kempten at the age of 87, having never spoken publicly about her status at any moment in her life. Manfred Rommel attended her funeral with all his children and grandchildren. At that funeral, Manfred acknowledged before his own family what she had always been. The fiction of the cousin had lasted 56 years since the death of their father. That same year, Gertrude's son, Anton Pan, published the 150 letters that Rommel had written to Walburger Stimme and that Gertrude had preserved throughout her life. The story those letters told had not been included in any of the publications the family had promoted about Erwin Rommel during the previous 5 decades. Those publications had been numerous and widely influential. Lucy never published memoirs, never granted in-depth interviews, and did not participate in any public initiative to rehabilitate her husband's image, although she did maintain correspondence with historians and with former Afrika Korps officers who began organizing the first veterans associations in the 1950s. She died in Stuttgart in 1971 without ever regaining a public position of her own. Manfred completed his Abitur in 1947 at the Beberich and Ries secondary schools, 2 institutions that had reopened under Allied supervision. He enrolled in the Faculty of Law at the University of Tübingen, one of the few universities in southwestern Germany whose main buildings had survived the war intact and which reopened in 1946 under license from the French Occupation Administration. Tübingen was located within the French zone, which meant that the denazification procedures applied to the teaching staff were enforced with greater rigor than at universities in the American zone, where the pressure to reopen academic institutions quickly led to the readmission of professors with compromised records at a pace that Allied prosecutors themselves would later criticize. Manfred graduated in law and in 1954 married Lieselotte Bach, a public administration employee in Stuttgart. In 1956, he himself entered that administration as a municipal civil servant, a position that required neither public projection nor political exposure, and that placed his name within the everyday bureaucracy of a city, rebuilding its industrial and urban infrastructure at a speed that foreign observers were already beginning to call the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. In those years, Stuttgart was the center of a region that concentrated some of the most dynamic manufacturing companies in the Federal Republic. Daimler-Benz had its headquarters in Untertürkheim within the metropolitan area. Bosch operated from Feuerbach. Porsche had moved its production to Zuffenhausen, also within the municipality. Manfred Rommel built his career within that apparatus, rising through positions of technical and legal management for nearly 2 decades before taking the step into elective politics. What the Stuttgart administration provided him during those years was a granular understanding of how an expanding industrial city actually functioned. Industrial growth, the management of a working population that since the 1950s had included an increasing number of guest workers, the Gastarbeiter initially recruited from Italy following the bilateral agreement of 1955 and later from Spain, Greece, Turkey and Yugoslavia. In 1974, the sudden death of the mayor of Stuttgart opened a scenario no one had anticipated. For the first time, the marshal's son would have to decide whether to remain in the shadows or accept stepping into public exposure before a city that knew his name well, but not the man who carried it. In the next section, we explain what he achieved. The pact of friendship between Rommel, Patton and Montgomery. How did the son of one of Hitler's marshals become a symbol of the new democratic Germany? On October 17, 1974, Arnulf Klett died of a heart attack while presiding over a meeting of the Stuttgart City Council. He had served as mayor of the city for 29 years, since the Americans appointed him to the position 2 weeks before the end of the war, and his death created a vacancy that the political apparatus of the state of Baden-Württemberg quickly turned into an opportunity. Hans Filbinger, the minister-president of the land since 1966, persuaded Manfred Rommel to run as the CDU candidate in the election called to fill the post. The conversation between the two men was not brief. Manfred had spent 18 years accumulating technical positions within the administration of the land without ever stepping into elective politics, and he had concrete reasons to distrust that step. Stuttgart had a tradition of independent or social democratic mayors. No CDU candidate had ever won the mayoralty of a major German city, and the surname that would appear on the ballots was one that carried a resonance in public opinion that he did not control and that no campaign could fully anticipate. The campaign Manfred designed with his collaborators during the autumn of 1974 deliberately avoided any reference to the field marshal. There were no proclamations invoking his father's figure. The surname appeared on every ballot, but it was not part of the argument. What the campaign presented was a municipal management program built around three pillars: strict control of public spending to reduce the debt accumulated during Klet's years of expansion, investment in transportation infrastructure as a structural condition for industrial productivity, and a position on foreign workers that no conservative candidate of that period had articulated with such precision before that electorate. On December 1st, 1974, Manfred Rommel obtained 58.9% of the vote in the first round, defeating the candidate Peter Conradi and becoming the first CDU mayor of a German city with more than 500,000 inhabitants. The first years of his administration were dominated by two simultaneous fronts that would define the character of his entire tenure. The first was financial. Stuttgart carried a large accumulated municipal debt that Klet had managed through a policy of service expansion without the parallel cost control that Manfred considered essential. The first measure of his mayoralty was a debt reduction program that cut current spending in non-essential areas while maintaining investments in infrastructure that he considered strategic. For Manfred, the modernization of public transport was not discretionary spending but a structural condition for the city's productivity. In 1977, he promoted the creation of the Verbund Region Stuttgart, the transportation and fare consortium that integrated the S-Bahn commuter rail network with trams and urban buses under a single fare and coordinated management, giving Stuttgart an integrated mobility system that later served as a model for other German cities during the 1980s. The expansion of Stuttgart Airport was another of his major long-term projects. Manfred, who automatically became chairman of the airport's supervisory board after being elected mayor, pushed for 2 decades the planning and eventual execution of the relocation and extension of the airport's only runway, whose length of 2,550 meters imposed weight restrictions that limited commercial traffic toward the west. The project was completed in 1996, the year of his retirement. The second front was integration. Manfred's policy regarding foreign workers began with an administrative diagnosis formulated in economic terms. A city whose industry depended on more than 100,000 foreign residents could not function efficiently if those residents lacked legal stability and access to services under conditions comparable to those of German workers. Legal insecurity generated labor turnover. It did not reduce it. The children of foreign workers educated in segregated classrooms or second-tier educational tracks would not become productive citizens of Stuttgart, but adults with insufficient qualifications for the positions the city would require in the following decade. The solution that Manfred articulated politically was not a multicultural theory, which he rejected as a concept, considering it a euphemism that postponed difficult decisions, but a set of concrete administrative measures: access for foreign families to the same municipal services as German families, the gradual elimination of residency restrictions that prevented family reunification, and explicit opposition to the federal rotations principe, which Manfred publicly described as a sword of Damocles that prevented any real process of social integration. Within the CDU, that position generated constant friction. During the 1970s, and particularly under Chancellor Helmut Kohl after 1982, the party maintained, with varying clarity depending on the political moment, that Germany was not and should not become a country of immigration, kein Einwanderungsland, a political formula deliberately aimed at signaling to an electorate that perceived the foreign presence as a threat to national identity. Manfred never adopted that formula. In Stuttgart, that divergence did not cost him votes. In 1982, he was re-elected with 69.8% of the vote in the first round, a majority that exceeded even the exceptional result he had obtained in 1974. The friendships that Manfred developed during those years made his figure difficult to place within any of the available political categories. George Smith Patton IV, the son of the American general who had pursued Erwin Rommel across North Africa, Sicily, and France during the last 2 years of the war, was stationed at the headquarters of the U.S. 7th Army Corps near Stuttgart. Their meeting was not the product of any symbolic initiative, but of institutional proximity. Patton IV was part of the NATO forces stationed in the region, and Manfred, as mayor, maintained regular relations with Allied military command. What began as protocol courtesy became a friendship documented in private correspondence and in joint appearances at commemorative events over several decades. They also shared a birthday. Both had been born on December 24th, Patton IV in 1923 and Manfred in 1928. David Montgomery, the second Viscount Montgomery of Alamein and son of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, was also part of that circle of relationships. His father had defeated Erwin Rommel at El Alamein in November 1942, a decisive battle in the North African campaign. Despite that past, he developed a relationship with Manfred that lasted nearly 30 years. Montgomery was a member of the House of Lords and regularly participated in the World War II commemorative events organized by the British military establishment with a frequency unmatched by any other nation. His friendship with the son of the German marshal his father had defeated was perceived in both countries as the most meaningful gesture of reconciliation the post-war period had produced in the sphere of personal relations. At the joint events where the two appeared together, the war of their fathers was reduced to the category of history, while they represented before photographers something that official diplomacy had never managed to produce with the same naturalness. In 1982, the New York Times described Manfred Rommel as one of the German politicians with the greatest potential for advancement to a federal or state-level office. Manfred consistently rejected every proposal in that direction. He had an answer he repeated with the dry humor characteristic of Swabia. Cities needed mayors who knew their streets, not men who knew the corridors of Bonn. In 1983, he oversaw the inauguration of the Hans-Martin Schleyer Halle, the city's largest congress and events hall, whose name was itself a political statement. It honored the president of the German Employers Association, who had been kidnapped and executed by the RAF in 1977, the same year in which Manfred had taken his most controversial decision. In 1990, he was re-elected with 71.7% of the vote in the first round, the highest result of his career. Stuttgart hosted the World Athletics Championships, whose candidacy Manfred had promoted for years as part of his strategy to position the city internationally. Chancellor Helmut Kohl appointed him coordinator of Franco-German relations, a position he held until 1999, 3 years after leaving the mayor's office. He governed Stuttgart until December 17, 1996, 22 years in total, without ever losing an election and without ever holding a position above the municipal level. Was Lucy Mollin the mind behind Rommel's public image, and what did the private letters the Marshal sent her actually say? Lucy Maria Mollin was born on June 6, 1904, in Danzig, a city that was then Prussian and is today Polish, into a family whose surnames came from Italy and Poland. Her father, Bernhard Mollin, was a civil servant. The city where she grew up was a Baltic port with a mixture of languages and traditions. Lucy studied languages with the methodical determination that would characterize the rest of her life: English, French, and Latin. She was a cultivated middle-class young woman with training in philology who won dance prizes at the city's social gatherings. In 1911, one of the students in that environment was 17 years old, had just arrived at the Kriegsschule in Danzig to complete his officer training, and his name was Erwin Rommel. The meeting between them was not dramatic. It was the kind of encounter that occurs in small cities when two people of the same age frequent the same places. Rommel was a young man from southern Germany, from Ulm, the son of a schoolteacher, without the Prussian pedigree that characterized most officers of his generation. Neither of them fit perfectly into the mold from which they came. Their relationship began during those early years, when Rommel was still completing his officer training and future prospects depended largely on the military career he had just begun. Erwin graduated in November 1911 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in January 1912, which meant an immediate posting to Weingarten, several days away from Danzig. What remained between them was correspondence. Erwin wrote almost daily from Weingarten, letters in pencil on folded paper in which he asked her to reply in detail, not to forget him, and to be patient with the demands of military service. In a letter from February 1913, he described his new residence in Weingarten, with 3 rooms, a kitchen and a bathroom, and added, with the mixture of humor and melancholy that characterized his private writing, that the only thing missing was a woman to manage it all. The commitment between them was real, but not formalized. Lucy's family was Catholic and viewed with suspicion a relationship with a Protestant officer from southern Germany, and Erwin avoided committing himself on paper while his financial situation and rank were not yet secure enough. Lucy waited. The almost daily correspondence between Danzig and Weingarten was for years the only thread sustaining their relationship. When, on November 27, 1916, Erwin obtained a leave from the war and returned to Danzig, they married. Rommel was 25 and had spent more than 2 years at the front. Lucy was 22. The ceremony took place in Danzig, the city where they had met, by then already a place transformed by the war into something almost unrecognizable. What followed during the 2 decades between their wedding and the beginning of World War II was a married life built on long absences and frequent letters. Rommel was an officer on a steady rise who spent months away from home on training assignments, maneuvers and missions. Lucy managed their successive homes, Stuttgart during the 1920s, then Goslar, then Potsdam, and learned to read the war through the envelopes that arrived from the front bearing her husband's handwriting. In December 1928, Manfred was born. He was their only child. When in February 1941, Erwin crossed into North Africa at the head of the Africa Corps, Lucy entered the longest and most tense period of those absences. For nearly 3 years, she followed the desert campaign through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the letters Erwin sent her with a regularity that did not diminish even during moments of intense operational pressure. Those letters were the most intimate record of what Rommel thought in real time. He wrote about the heat, the sand, the men, and about Hitler with a deference that in the early years carried no critical nuance. In a letter from November 1939, before Africa, he had written that the failed assassination attempt against Hitler by the carpenter Georg Elser seemed to him inconceivable. In letters from the early years of the African campaign, he referred to the Führer as the Master. Lucy kept those letters. She did not publish them. She did not include them in the Rommel papers, and their existence did not become public until decades later. In May 1943, Erwin was evacuated from North Africa in a state of severe clinical exhaustion. Lucy traveled to the field hospital in Sfax to be beside him during his recovery. It was the first time she had seen him in months. What she found was not the man from the propaganda photographs. It was an officer of 51 whose nervous system had been worn down by 30 months of campaigning under extreme conditions, who had directed operations from the front when almost any other commander would have remained in the rear, and whose body had begun to pay the price for that method. Lucy remained in Sfax for as long as the military situation allowed and returned to Germany when Erwin was assigned to new fronts. In October 1943, the family settled in the villa in Herrlingen near Ulm, which would become their final shared home. Erwin was in command of Army Group B in France. Lucy was in Herrlingen with Manfred, who was already serving in an auxiliary anti-aircraft battery of the Luftwaffe. On June 6, 1944, the day of the Allied landings in Normandy, Erwin celebrated Lucy's 50th birthday in Herrlingen. He was on leave. He returned to the front the following day. On July 17th, his vehicle was strafed by an Allied fighter on a road in Normandy. Erwin was severely wounded in the skull. He was transferred to Herrlingen to recover. 3 months later, on October 14th, the 2 generals arrived. After Erwin's death, Allied intelligence services began arriving in Herrlingen in the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945. The American officer Charles Marshall interviewed Lucy about the circumstances of her husband's death. She confirmed what Manfred had already revealed to de Lattre in April: the ultimatum, the capsule, the official lie. The conversations were procedural and did not lead to any formal proceedings. There was no legal basis to act against her. The pension included in the October agreement, calculated on the rank of Field Marshal, continued to be paid under Allied administration and later under the Federal Republic. It had been the price the regime set for Erwin's silence, and that price survived the regime that had established it. Lucy remained in Herrlingen. She did not return to Danzig. which by then was Gdansk and part of Poland. She did not seek any public role of her own. She received the journalists, historians, and filmmakers who came to document Erwin's figure with the calm of someone who had learned that every word spoken in that context had consequences that extended far beyond the conversation. She collaborated with Desmond Young for the 1950 biography. She served as a consultant for the James Mason film in 1951, in which she was portrayed by Jessica Tandy, and for The Longest Day in 1962, where Ruth Hausmeister played her. In neither case was her consulting credit accompanied by public statements about her own perspective. Every year, on the anniversary of Erwin's death, veterans of the Afrika Korps gathered at the cemetery in Herrlingen beside the grave marked with a wooden cross. They came from Germany, from Austria, and from other countries. Some had served under his command in Libya and Egypt. Others had simply followed the campaign from afar and felt they owed something to that name. Lucy did not preside over those ceremonies. She was present, but she did not lead them. The difference between the two was the same distinction she had maintained throughout her widowhood, being present without allowing that presence to become an argument. On February 1st, 1969, at the age of 74, Lucy travelled to Bath, Maine, to christen the Bundesmarine destroyer that would carry her husband's name. The ship, built in American shipyards under a NATO cooperation agreement, would be called D-187 Rommel and would serve in the Navy of the Federal Republic for 28 years. That a 74-year-old German widow christened on American soil a German warship built by American engineers to defend the Atlantic flank of the Alliance was, from any perspective, the most precise summary available of what the 25 years since that road near Herrlingen had produced. Lucy performed the gesture expected of her with the same restraint she had practiced in every public appearance since 1944. She delivered no speeches. She granted no in-depth interviews. She died in Stuttgart on September 26, 1971, at the age of 77. She was buried in Herrlingen beside Erwin in the cemetery where veterans continued to gather every October. Her gravestone records her name and her dates. She published no memoirs. She left no written account signed in her own name about her experiences. What she left instead was her oral testimony to those who constructed the narrative of Erwin during the first 2 decades of the post-war period, and the decision about which parts of that testimony would enter the books and which would remain in Herrlingen. The fourth Rommel generation and the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Catherine Rommel is the adopted daughter of Manfred and his wife Lieselotte. The couple had no biological children, so the continuation of the surname within the family does not come from blood, but from a decision. Catherine carries the Rommel name without a biological connection to the field marshal or to the historic mayor of Stuttgart, a circumstance that has shaped the way her public image is perceived. Born in 1965, she was 9 years old when Manfred won the mayoralty of Stuttgart in 1974. Her path followed a route far removed from politics for decades. She studied at the Stuttgarter Heidehof Gymnasium, completed banking training at Dresdner Bank, and studied economics in Freiburg, finishing in Mannheim with the degree of Diplom-Kauffrau in business administration. She worked as a business consultant, directed the marketing division of a DEKRA subsidiary, and later managed her own agency in the media sector. She later trained as a business coach at the Steinbeis Hochschule in Berlin. She is a single mother of 2 children, Leonard and Sarah, and lives in the Stuttgart district of Seelenbuch. During the 2021 election campaign, she summarized her ambivalent relationship with her surname in a single sentence. You receive attention, wanted or unwanted, that is not always positive. And then you have to prove yourself. Since Manfred's death in 2013, Catherine has acted as the unofficial spokesperson for the Rommel family. Journalists, historians, and documentary producers turn to her when they seek a family position on the figure of the marshal or on the public memory attached to the surname. That role became particularly visible when she ran as the CDU candidate for mayor of Aalen in 2021. Aalen was not just any place in the family's history. Erwin Rommel had grown up there. His father had served as director of the local Latin school, and Erwin himself had studied there before entering the Württemberg army in 1910. Even his brother Karl worked for decades as a dentist in the city after the war. Catherine's candidacy came only 3 weeks before the official filing deadline. Asked about the weight of the surname, she stated that she often wondered whether the inhabitants of Aalen were aware of how beautiful their city was, and added that the values transmitted by Manfred had been openness, liberalism, and tolerance. The context, however, was complex. For years, Aalen had been debating the public meaning of the Rommel name. Since 2019, there had been an open controversy surrounding Erwin Rommel Strasse after the local president of the DGB trade union, Josef Mischko, called for its renaming. He argued that it was contradictory to honor victims of Nazism through Stolperstein while at the same time maintaining the name of one of Hitler's generals in public space. After months of conferences and debates, the City Council decided in February 2020 to keep the street name but accompany it with explanatory plaques presenting Rommel as an ambivalent figure, both an executor of the regime and, at the same time, a victim of it. Before the municipal elections, Catherine appeared before the local council to speak about her grandfather. In the end, she did not win the mayoralty. The debate was not limited to Aalen. In those same years, cities such as Erlangen, Ludwigsburg, and Hemmingen were also discussing whether streets named after Rommel should be retained. The Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen requested in 2021 that the street near its campus be renamed, arguing that the name was problematic for an international academic environment. Meanwhile, the Bundeswehr continued to maintain 2 barracks bearing the marshal's name. The Ministry of Defense argued in 2019 that Rommel remained a valid military reference because he had refused to carry out certain criminal orders in Africa. However, a report by the Scientific Service of the Bundestag, published that same year, concluded that his connection to the resistance against Nazism had been more limited than the narrative constructed in the post-war years had claimed. Catherine's children already represent the 4th generation. Leonard studies physics at the University of Tübingen, the same institution where Manfred studied law after the war, and Sarah is pursuing studies in psychology and pedagogy. Neither of them has made public statements about the surname they carry. In 1950, the British brigadier Desmond Young published the first major biography of Rommel, The Desert Fox, a book that the historian Patrick Major would later describe as a work bordering on hagiography. 3 years later, in 1953, the Rommel Papers appeared, a collection of the Marshal's wartime writings edited by the British military strategist Basil Liddell Hart with the collaboration of Lucy, Manfred and Rommel's former Chief of Staff in Africa, Fritz Bayerlein. The edition itself was an act of narrative construction. Liddell Hart had interests that extended beyond rehabilitating the fallen adversary. By persuading Lucy to include material presenting Rommel as a disciple of his own theories of mechanized warfare, the British historian was able to claim part of the intellectual credit for the German successes in France in 1940, and to present his own concept of the indirect approach as the doctrinal precursor of blitzkrieg. The political scientist John Mearsheimer documented that manipulation decades later in detail in his analysis of Liddell Hart's historical influence, describing the process as putting words into the mouths of German generals to manipulate history. For the Western Allies, however, the narrative that emerged from those publications had a usefulness that extended far beyond Liddell Hart's personal ambitions. Beginning in 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War turned the rearmament of the Federal Republic of Germany into a strategic priority for NATO. To rebuild a German army that would be acceptable to Anglo-American public opinion and to German society itself, it was necessary to rehabilitate the image of the Wehrmacht as an institution, to demonstrate that it had been possible to serve effectively in Hitler's army without being ideologically Nazi, without participating in war crimes, and without knowledge of the extermination camps. The doctrine that emerged from that exercise became known as the Clean Wehrmacht myth, and Rommel was its most useful case. If the most famous general of the war could be presented as an honorable man who died resisting the regime, then the principle could be extended to the thousands of former officers who needed to be reintegrated into the new Bundeswehr, formally founded on November 5, 1955. Churchill had called him a great general in Parliament in 1942. The 20th Century Fox film of 1951, starring James Mason, built upon that phrase to create a portrayal that turned the narrative of the Desert Fox into popular culture on an Atlantic scale. Lucy and Manfred had actively contributed to that narrative. They had managed the archive, which letters were published in the Rommel papers, how Erwin's relationship with the Nazi regime was contextualized, which aspects of that relationship were emphasized and which were omitted. The image the family helped construct insisted on Rommel's distance from Nazism, on his connection to the July 20th conspiracy, on his documented refusal to carry out Hitler's order in Africa to execute captured Allied commandos, and on the Kommissarbefehl that Rommel had ignored in North Africa, unlike what had occurred on other fronts. What had not been included in any of those publications was the evidence, available in archives captured by the Allies since 1945, that Hitler had granted Rommel personal donations worth 250,000 Reichsmarks in 1944, intended for the purchase and expansion of the family residence. Nor was the real ambiguity of his connection to the July 20th plot included, documented in detail by the German historian Ralph Georg Reuth in his 2004 book Rommel, Das Ende einer Legende, in which Reuth argued that Rommel may have remained loyal to Hitler until the failure of the assassination made that loyalty politically untenable, without his connection to the conspirators ever reaching the level of active participation that the post-war narrative attributed to the episode. In the maturity of his political life, when the historiographical revision of the Rommel myth had become an established academic field with dozens of critical monographs, Manfred never responded to those criticisms with the same clarity with which he had responded to the scandal of the RAF burial. The man who had stated without hesitation that all enmity ends in death, and who had defended the right of Turkish workers to establish permanent residence in Stuttgart against the official position of his own party, avoided that same frankness when the subject was his father's archive. His memoirs, published in 1998 under the title Trotz allem heiter, Despite Everything Cheerful, contained only a brief reference to Gertrude Pan. There was no explanation of why the fiction of the cousin had lasted 56 years. There was no analysis of what his contribution to the Rommel papers had meant in terms of how others later used that narrative. It was the zone of silence of a man who had built a political career on transparency and candor, and who, at a precise point in his own history, had decided that silence was the only possible answer. Gertrude Pan died in the year 2000. She had held in her hands the wool with which she knitted the scarf that her father wore in photographs, the only visible proof of a bond that no one at the time had known how to read. Manfred attended her funeral and acknowledged before his own family what she had always been. By then, he was 71 years old and had spent 4 years out of the mayor's office, facing the advance of Parkinson's disease that would accompany him for the rest of his life. He died on November 7, 2013 in Stuttgart at the age of 84, in the same city where he had been born and to which he had devoted 22 years of municipal government. Stuttgart Airport has borne the name of Manfred Rommel since 2014. It does not bear the name of the field marshal. It bears that of the mayor. The two names, although they are the same surname, correspond to stories that intersect without being identical. One is the story of a soldier whom the regime manufactured as a symbol and later eliminated when he ceased to serve that purpose, and whose death was turned by his family and by his former enemies into the foundation of a narrative that Cold War West Germany needed in order to reintegrate into the international order without carrying the full weight of what that war had meant. The other is the story of a man who grew up knowing that this narrative was partly true and partly constructed, who governed for 22 years without losing an election, who buried terrorists because he had understood since the age of 16 what it meant for a state to decide who deserved a funeral and who did not, and who kept silent about the story of his sister long enough for her to die without ever having to speak it publicly. The question that remains after those two stories is why the distinction between them matters so much and why it proved so difficult to sustain.